Thank you very much. It's really an honor to be here. Thank you, Aruna, Jill, Michael, and other colleagues. I'm looking forward to your comments. This is a new project and fragile, so I'm keen to hear what you think. We're led to believe that when a particularly significant event occurs, the moment is etched into our mind's eye. Every detail of our clothing, every word spoken by a stranger or confidant, the flavor of each morsel on the plate is memorable. Smells, sounds, and images come together to create a moment seemingly frozen in time. The permanency is, of course, a fiction. The moment passes, never to be relived. We all know where we were on September 11, 2001. We recall the location, the room, the street corner, the subway, being up late in the night listening to the news if you were in Asia, waking up to the horrific images of destruction and terror if you were in California. Wherever we found ourselves in the world, the images of airplanes flying into the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center and the collapse of those iconic buildings of mid-century American architecture are forever etched in our minds. Times Square, 1500, Cordoba, Daniel Libeskind, Bridgeport, Garden, New York, Shehzad Faisal, Cairo, Military Time, Geller, Mosque, Car Bomb, Storefront, Immigrants, Pakistan, Ground Zero, 2010. The list of words, names, dates, and associations could continue, like the list in Jorge Luis Borges' imaginary Chinese encyclopedia. Together, they form a taxonomy of knowledge which has its own order and informs a manner of thinking. The list I've just read is not a random collection either, but evocative of a particular historical moment and multiple geographic locations. Interestingly, this list would be recognizable to any number of people, English speakers or otherwise, anywhere in the world. What it would mean to the varied audiences, however, is far from homogeneous. At least two sets of images come into play. The first is replicated on television and computer screens and on the pages of newspapers and magazines. The second set is more intimate and refers to the earth below our own feet, the habitual spaces that we inhabit. The near and the distant come together, and it's sometimes difficult to separate the two. Thus, our present history and our personal geography coalesce through a series of shared images. In this paper, I explore issues of time and geography as mediated not by fleeting images alone, but by the act of building. Both history and architecture are subject to dynamic and mutable processes of interpretation. Both serve as signs and agents in issues of transnationalism at the beginning of the 21st century. I use the term transnational as opposed to global in order to avoid binaries such as those employed by global-local. Instead, I suggest transnational, which contains within it the national identities that I believe remain central to contemporary discourses. Thus, the prefix trans connotes the act of moving both across and beyond, simultaneously the nation and an ahistorical conception of time. Transnational is also more tangible than global and inclusive of different scales of participation. As Ulf Hannertz writes, quote, "In the transnational arena, the actors may now be individuals, groups, movements, business enterprises, and in no small part it is this diversity of organization that we need to consider," unquote. I'd like to explore two parallel issues raised by the conference. On the one hand, a re-examination of the term transnational vis-à-vis art history, and second, to think of how we may reorient the conception of history and geography when thinking of contemporary architecture and its representations. I aim to interrogate how buildings may serve as a form of negotiation between disparate positions by focusing on the Park 51 Islamic Center, proposed to be built in Lower Manhattan. Through this study, I provide a methodological approach to the questions raised in this conference of, quote, "the presumptions about time and the directions of history," unquote. Connected as it uncomfortably is to September 11, 2001, the center represents the interstices between which architecture between architecture and its fictional representations, between a particular site and its multiple relocations. Architecture emerges as the repository of historical consciousness, serving as it does to both monumentalize belief and situate it within particular geographic and ideological sites. Although a building like Park 51 may have a singular physical location, it will arguably reference places far removed from Manhattan and moments remarkably distant from its date of construction. This mobility marks contemporary architectural practice and subverts ideas of regionalism and nationalist styles that have pervaded the discourse on architecture in the 20th century. The Islamic Community Center especially challenges the representation of Islam as a monolithic identity shared across centuries and continents. Instead, examples such as Park 51 highlight the transregional and transhistorical trends that define architecture and religion today. Let me first begin with Park 51, the cultural and commercial center that you see up on the screen, a proposal of, that has been the focus of immense controversy over the past year and a half. And I know that there are many New Yorkers in the audience, and I'm curious to hear what you think. In a recent episode, the PBS Frontline series called Park 51, quote, the most controversial building in America, no doubt in reference to the schisms and polemics that surround the project. And the photograph that you see, the snap that you see shows Sharif Al-Gamal, who's the owner of Soho Realty, the developer of the project. Religious ideology and architecture collide here in ways that are problematic, yet telling, not just about the state of world politics, but also about the manner in which architecture, both as form and rhetoric, becomes a litmus test for both creating and dividing communities. The original name of the center was Cordoba House, in reference to the Andalusian capital city of the Umayyads, which flourished for many centuries as a diverse and multi-confessional medieval city. Cordoba was also renowned for the monumental Great Mosque, built in the 8th century over the foundations of a Visigothic church. It was converted back into a cathedral in the 13th century following the Spanish reconquest. The mosque remains one of the most well-known examples of Islamic architecture, even as it today serves as a Christian devotional space. Such transfers of authority and changes in belief are not uncommon in the history of religion. Yet at the turn of the 21st century, they're fraught with nationalist politics and sectarian fears, as witnessed with Cordoba House. In 2002, Imam Faisal Abdul Rauf, a cleric whose ministry is in Lower Manhattan, established the Cordoba Initiative, which he characterized as a multi-faith organization. Imam Ralph was born in Egypt, grew up in Kuwait, studied in the US, currently lives in New York City, and is a proponent of Sufi Islam. He has also served as an American representative, having been sent by the State Department to Muslim countries such as Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. In his writings, as well as his diplomacy, his stated goal is, quote, to repair the damages done to Muslim-American relations in recent years and to use the formula, that is the Cordoba Initiative, to forge a partnership between faith traditions so as to build a new Cordoba, unquote. Thus, the goal was to recreate an historical site through the construction of an institution and soon thereafter a monument. Cordoba House was the name given to the collaboration between the Cordoba Initiative and Soho Realties, the local developer that I just mentioned. They proposed an Islamic community center to be built in Park Place in Lower Manhattan by renovating a building previously housing the Burlington Coat Factory, which is a retail clothing chain. The structure is a typical downtown tenement, which is to be torn down and replaced by the center. The program would include diverse facilities such as a swimming pool, an auditorium, and a prayer space. The center, according to both Rauf and the developer, was to be modeled on local institutions such as the 92nd Street Y, which is a Jewish organization with strong ties to its Upper East Side community. In 2004, Imam Ralph published What's Right with Islam, a new vision for Muslims in the West, in which he explains the divergent conceptions of history, philosophy, and eschatology in Islam, More mundanely, he asserts that history is important in helping us understand why many Muslims and Americans feel the way they do about each other. Moving beyond the need to quantify and understand this schism, Imam Ralph sees the present moment as an opportunity to move toward creating an ideal multi-faith society such as Cordoba. In his lectures and books, Imam Ralph stresses the symbiotic relationship between Islam and America and suggests, perhaps incongruously, that the founding principles of this nation may be seamlessly joined with the teachings of Muhammad to create, quote, a globalized religiosity, unquote. In his stated challenge is to reconcile the particularities of Islam with the generalities of a democratic constitution. In addition, the goal is to merge the so-called universals of human belief with the specificity of contemporary life in the United States. Thus, there is, in Imam Ralph's conceptualization, a tension between the nation and the world, between an idea and its execution, between universal time and the historic moment. Despite the multifaceted program of Cordoba House, one element became the primary focus of a vitriolic debate about its legitimacy. In the spring of 2010, a group called Stop the Islamization of America, led by the columnist Pamela Geller and the activist Robert Spencer, started to protest against the construction of what they called the Ground Zero Mosque. Until this time, Cordoba House's mandate as a multi-faith center had not been questioned. Isolating one of its functions, namely a devotional space, opponents of the Islamic Community Center attached to it another reference, Ground Zero. Some family members of the September 11th victims spoke now of the grave disrespect done to the memories of their loved ones. Others, such as Pam Geller, warned that this was a cynical move by Muslim extremists to commemorate their own dead. Several New Yorkers, including Mayor Bloomberg, rallied against these mischaracterizations. The issue gained such traction that leaders of progressive Jewish organizations and those of the Palestinian Hamas gave their support to the construction of Cordoba House. As the entire world looked on, in fact, even President Barack Obama sort of fumbled through the controversy. The ensuing turmoil resulted in an internal struggle for the representation of the center itself. The result was a break between Imam Ralph and Soho Realties, and the name Cordoba House was changed to Park 51, thus from a cultural reference to a Manhattan street address. The opponents of Cordoba House, and now Park 51, had conjured in their minds an image of a mosque, its monumental dome casting a shadow over Ground Zero, its minaret piercing the New York City skyline like a victory stele. And of course, it's really curious to see the mistranslations that happened in the process. This quote that you see attributed to Erdogan, the prime minister of Turkey at the time, that mosques are barracks, that our domes are helmets, the minarets are bayonets, and the faithful are soldiers, is a quote that was taken from the early 20th century nationalist secular philosopher of Turkey, Ziya Gökalp. So he is misused by Erdogan, who is then misused by these opponents to the mosque. The image, nonetheless, is a powerful one, used in satire as well as political propaganda, both to lampoon the issue and to fuel the heated debates that surround it. In neither case is the image, read mosque, an innocent one. What had for millennia been seen by Muslims as a symbol of their religion was now used against Islam. The whole earth is a mosque is a common saying attributed to the Prophet Muhammad. Regardless of where Muslims may find themselves, the main requisites to prayer are ritual ablution and facing in the direction of Mecca. Mosques are built as physical manifestations of Islam and continue to serve the needs of diverse communities. At the turn of the 21st century, however, mosques have sometimes come to be associated with violence and are viewed as sites from which extremist ideologies are disseminated. Two examples come immediately to mind, which you see on the screen just now. The Grand Mosque in Mecca, which was seized in 1979 by a group of dissidents who claimed the apocalyptic arrival of the Mahdi. In the summer of 2007, the Red Mosque in Islamabad was the scene of a catastrophic showdown between the Pakistani army and the students of the adjacent Jamia Hafsa Madrasa. In both cases, the mosques, one historic, the other modern, have become synonymous with a resurgent, if not homogeneous, vision of militant Islam. Thus, it's of little surprise that the anti-Muslim sentiments in New York City were mobilized around this very potent symbol. Recognizing the need to diffuse the issue, Soho Realties brought in the designer Michel Abboud, principal of Soma Architects, to give form to Park 51. According to Abboud, the immediate goal was to negate the virulent media onslaught manipulated by images of mosques and missile-like minarets with a more benign one that would resettle the project back to the context of New York City, back from the confusing historical and geographical journeys that it had taken. As Abboud said in his presentation of the project, quote, "The iconography of the building became the main concern, to promote a message of openness and integration of the Muslim community with the city of New York and its various communities of faith," unquote. And this is, of course, not unproblematic, and perhaps we can talk about this in the discussion section, but for now I want you to suspend judgment for a moment. Thus, a highly charged, if anachronistic, image of Park 51 was to be replaced by one equally powerful, if less threatening. The proposed architectural design, which is still in the form of an image, was to serve as a resolution between conflicting opinions about the Islamic Community Center. I'll return to this idea of architecture as resolution in my conclusion, but I want to now turn to the design proposed by Michel Abboud before speaking a bit about the architect himself. The architectural proposal for Park 51 is captivating, if not particularly groundbreaking, in its rendition. The sparkling white facade contrasts with the dull browns and grays of the neighboring buildings, its profile looking like a clean incision into the urban fabric. The brutality of a modernist cut is muted by the articulation of the facade, which appears perforated and transparent. The architect, like several of his contemporaries designing for Muslim clients, relied heavily on ideas of Islamic geometric patterning to generate a design strategy. Abboud manipulated the surface decoration to create a three-dimensional exoskeleton, which would act both as the facade and a structural armature. The exoskeleton is meant to respond to the programming, gaining depth and opacity according to the functions embedded in the structure. Quoting esoteric themes from Islamic philosophy to diagramming the porosity of the structure, a series of formal exercises were undertaken. Now you see just a few of them here. The depth transmitted by the skin of the building was achieved through parametric design, which is the method commonly employed by architects today to solve complex programming and to provide novel architectural solutions. In an intriguing play with pseudo-historical design elements and contemporary graphics software, Abboud appears to work backward to justify his design, that is, looking for sources for what is, by his own characterizations, a formal design exercise that does not aim to engage with history. In his presentations, he insists that he's not looking for examples in Islamic architecture, but rather at their one essential component, which is the ornament, and of course this is extremely problematic in itself. Yet, iconography is once again the driving force, merged now with its own representation. The heavy insistence on using Islamic ornament in the design of Park 51 brings me to the core issue here, namely the role of history as a generative design principle, and the utility of architecture as a source of negotiating that temporal and, by extension, philosophical distance. Stepping away for a moment from Park 51, the first aspect to consider is the deployment of historical narrative. The second related factor is the understanding of geography, not as location. Both history and geography coalesce along a disciplinary conjunction that is chronological and spatial. They reflect the manner in which architectural history in this millennium is implicated as a source of inspiration as well as an ethical principle. If we agree that architecture, like history, has a narrativizing tendency, then it too requires moral imagination as a creative and driving force. Let me explain a little bit more. Soho Realty has developed a sophisticated website for Park 51, which aims to cater to a diverse local community. Besides hosting daily prayers, there are activities that purport to both disseminate Park 51's role as a community center and to educate the general public about Islam. Historical reference is not limited to the nomenclature of the building, that is first Cordoba House and then Park Place, nor to architectural design. Rather, it penetrates all aspects of Park 51's mission. The present is as vital a resource as the past, as seen in two cultural programs that have recently been undertaken. A photographic exhibition of immigrant children in New York City affirms that the primary audience of Park 51 are New Yorkers, regardless of their religious identities. Another show, The Bridge of Light, Rumi, America's best-selling poet and a voice for interfaith, foregrounds the life of the 13th century Persian mystic, whose poetry touches on themes of love and belief. Now, promoting Rumi as, quote, an essential bridge between East and West, quote, unquote, and making him a symbol of interfaith dialogue is anachronistic, clearly, and strangely disturbing. Yet it is precisely the anachronistic use of time that typifies the debates surrounding Park 51. History is shaped by both the critics and promoters of the building in ways meant to serve their own needs. Why bring history into the debate at all? What is it about the present moment that makes it necessary to collapse temporal distance? I'd like to suggest that this often skewed interpretation of history, in particular religious history, defines contemporary society, whether it be evangelical Christianity in the United States or Salafi Islam in Saudi Arabia. Religion provides the primal historical moment in the discourse on political identity today. In an age where other histories of nations or empires are suspect, religious fundamentals cannot be so easily contested. That is, religion serves as our day one, as our ideological ground zero. Space has also collapsed in debates about Park 51, as though Pakistan, Cordoba, New York, Saudi Arabia all fall into a broadened experiential field that gives access to what at first seems like profoundly different landscapes. However, knowledge about these sites is often abbreviated and predetermined, dependent on the political locations from which the information emanates. I'd like to turn now to the issue of transnationalism introduced earlier. In the past 20 years, studies on globalization have tended to flatten difference through an exuberant positivism. Yet cases such as Park 51 reveal its shortcomings. Issues of globalization appear to hover above the discussion, describing a superstructure without providing strategies for meaningful discussion or analysis. They do not answer the question of what is meant vis-à-vis transnational mobility of religion, politics, images, and architectural signification. Architecture at the turn of this millennium is limited by concepts such as globalization and requires instead an understanding of the processes of movement and communication that define transnational events and practices such as those discussed. Indeed, it is the nodal exchanges that emphasize the associative and appropriative nature of architectural representations, and perhaps a more useful method may be provided by the mobilities paradigm, a phrase coined by Mimi Scheller and John Ury some years back. In their characterization, the mobility of ideas, people, and art is best understood as a series of fluid interdependencies, not as separate, independent phenomena. Michel Abboud's firm, SOMA, provides a good example of the manner in which geography and chronology may be considered as fluid mobilities. The firm is based in New York, with offices in Mexico City and Beirut, and I'm sorry you might not be able to read it very well. Although construction management is overseen by the regional offices alone, design development takes place in each and any of these three offices, dependent on the location of the principal architect. Information is saved and shared on a cloud server that is accessible anywhere in the world. According to the firm's website, the goal of the three offices is, quote, to ensure this is written up there, around-the-clock success of projects of all scales, that is, they're up any time in the world, they're up somewhere. An international amalgamation of a young and highly developed workforce spanning 13 nationalities and led by the principal Michel Abboud allows for the ease of execution of creative and complex programs within complex sites globally, unquote. Technology allows for the ease of transnational practice, yet it is the individual biography, the mobility of identity, that is the ultimate apparatus needed here. Abboud was born in Beirut, grew up in Paris, received his architecture degree in New York, and foregrounds his Mexican roots. He is Christian Lebanese, French, American. His identity is made up of several nationalities, that is to say, he negotiates the world as a transnational citizen. His familiarity with different ethnicities and cultures, and this is, of course, often oblique, legitimizes his claim to design diverse projects, from condominiums in the United States to beach villas in Lebanon to a new residential development in Erbil, Iraq. It is important to acknowledge the microcosmic and intricate negotiations that provide mobility to an architectural practice such as that of Michel Abboud. He was, of course, the ideal architect for the Park 51 Community Center, precisely because of his vast network and multifaceted identity. Bridging gaps between the United States and the Middle East, as well as between Christianity and Islam, Abboud can claim to speak for, or at least relate to, multiple audiences, even as he defines himself primarily as a New Yorker. I believe Abboud's firm is very different from those headed by star architects such as Sir Norman Foster and Zaha Hadid, in that it does not privilege one location, often in Europe or the United States, over any other. Foster and Hadid are part of a predetermined canonical architectural culture, and their success is facilitated by multinational entities, from corporations to media networks. Figures such as Michel Abboud represent an interesting alternative, with the imminent access allowed them through their mutable identities. In addition, and I think this is more interesting, younger architects such as Abboud find it easier to address issues that an earlier generation did not feel comfortable with, namely politics and global citizenship. Despite what one may think of Abboud, and he definitely does have his critics, or about Park 51, what is intriguing is the manner in which both also address architecture through the lens of ethical responsibility. According to Abboud, the design of Park 51 was meant to move the project from, quote, controversy to resolution, unquote. In his recent presentations at the Architecture Foundation and Columbia University, he said that the true challenge was to create an architecture that would propose a platform for the mediation of social, cultural, urban, and political difference in one coherent environment that would cater equally to all parties. That is, the design would appeal equally to Muslims who would recognize, it is hoped, its cultural references, and to New Yorkers who would see the building as another innovative insertion into the fabric of their city. That the design is flexible enough to reference simultaneously Islamic ornament and modernist aesthetic speaks both to the polyvalent nature of urban life and the fluidity of visual imagery in contemporary culture. In conclusion, the idea of architecture as negotiation is not a novel one. Nonetheless, it does stand out in the current climate of celebrity architects and mega projects that often gloss over issues of political ethics, moral judgment, or environmentalism. While Park 51 does not claim to address these issues directly, or in some cases at all, it does introduce some of the themes. By taking a stand against their detractors through aesthetic and programmatic choices, the designer and developer of Park 51 place architecture squarely within the debates on the role of religion in the public sphere, the rights of minority groups, as well as what constitutes historical preservation. They recognize clearly the impact of Park 51's representation and utilize architectural design as a mode of resolution. If one accepts the premise that architectural design and the mobility of its references are dynamic processes, one may also accept the role, as I mentioned earlier, of imagination in negotiating both religious ideologies and aesthetic possibilities. In so doing, we may expand the notion of transnational connections that provide room for difference, but also foundations for communication. And it is within these interstitial spaces that I believe art history may also find its voice. Thank you.